So the first thing I'm going to ask you is, do you believe Stephen Avery killed Teresa Halbach?
Yes, I do.
Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, thank you so much for joining me. I'm so excited to have you, and if you're returning, thanks so much for coming back. I'm excited to see you again. On my channel, we talk about a true crime story or something paranormal or creepy history or just anything that I kind of found interesting that week. So if that's something you might be interested in, you could do me a favor and hit the little subscribe button down below, as well as the bell icon so you can be notified when I upload. Only if you want to though, no pressure. I do want to give a quick warning. Some of the things that we talk about on this channel can be kind of heavy, so if that's something your mental health cannot handle, do me a favor and click off this video. I will catch you somewhere else, but your mental health will always be so much more important than any YouTube video ever will be. I want to give a quick warning that today we're going to be talking about things like SA and animal cruelty, so this one in particular is going to be pretty heavy. So if you don't want to watch this one, go ahead and skip it, please. Another quick warning I like to give is that these are real stories that affected real people. So always remember that while discussing the case or whatever in the comments. I just like things to remain respectful and don't remove yourself too far from the case. I know I'm guilty of it as well, and I think it's just super important to remember that these are real stories. So yeah. I know last week I said I would put this video up on Saturday, but as I was editing the footage, I was super unhappy with it, and I didn't like the flow of it at all. I didn't feel like it made any sense and it wasn't like coherent. So I just decided to refilm and get it up today. So this is what you're seeing. But yeah, like I said in my last video, I want to take a step back and focus on what's really important in this case, and that's Teresa Halbach. She is the real victim when it comes to Stephen Avery. And I just want to take a couple of minutes before we dive into the next part of the case and just remember Teresa for who she was. Teresa's life was taken far too soon, but the life that she did live was full of love and adventure. Teresa was the person who traveled and liked to just live life to the absolute fullest. She loved her family fiercely, and her family loved her. Teresa wasn't just talented when it came to her photography. She had a knack for making people smile, not only when it came to taking pictures of them, but just in everyday life. Teresa was a wonderful blessing to all of the lives that she touched, and so please remember her as we move forward. Today I want to dive a little bit deeper into Stephen Avery and his past. Now, a lot of times online, I saw the discussion that Stephen Avery's past convictions had nothing to do with the Teresa Halbach case, but I will disagree on that a little bit. I do think that it is very important, and it speaks to who Stephen was. I know most of the time when we're talking about a true crime story, we go into the past of the perpetrators, what they were like as children and what they experienced as children. So I think it's equally as important to discuss Stephen Avery's past when it comes to Teresa Halbach. And Stephen Avery had a pretty long list of convictions before he was accused of murdering Teresa Halbach. This started all the way back when he was just 18 years old. Some of these past convictions were discussed in the first documentary, Making a Murderer, but I really feel like they were not discussed in depth, or they were just kind of glossed over. So I want to get a little bit more in depth on who Stephen Avery was before the accusations or before being convicted of murdering Teresa Halbach. This, like I said, starts all the way when he was 18 years old. In Making a Murderer, they did discuss the first burglary that he was a part of, saying that Stephen was running around with friends and he broke into a bar and stole 2 6-packs of beer, a cheese sandwich, and like $14 in quarters. But it wasn't quite that simple. Yes, Stephen did break into this bar with a group of his friends, or with one of his friends. I couldn't really decipher which one it was, but Stephen did break into this bar. But it wasn't just one time that he broke into this bar. Stephen, the very first time they did this, they broke a window and gained access to the bar through this window. They stole the things that were discussed, and then when the bar owner came and realized that this window was broken, he boarded it up with some cardboard until he was able to replace the window. Stephen came back again after this, and he tore the cardboard from the window and once again burglarized this bar. When the bar owner realized that he had been burglared again, he put up some plywood over this broken window. Stephen came back again, This time he tore the plywood off the window and again burglarized this bar. This wasn't a one-off thing where he was riding around with friends being crazy. He did this multiple times. And it wasn't just this bar that he had burglared. He and his friend would go to people's homes and burglarize their homes, breaking into their garages and into their homes and stealing multiple things like rifles, shotguns. He stole liquor. He stole all kinds of things that were personal property from these people. He would steal TVs and speakers and ammunition. And Stephen and his friend, after they had stolen these items, they would take them to the Avery's cabin that was in Crivets, and that's where they stashed all of their stolen goods. It was actually Stephen's father, Alan Avery, who found these items and called the police. Alan Avery showed up to his cabin one day and realized that there was a whole bunch of things there that were not his, so he called police and made a report about these items that were there. They would actually, the law enforcement would actually hunt down Stephen's friend, and Stephen's friend would admit to everything and letting them know that Stephen was also involved in this, and that's why it was on the Avery property. Stephen was convicted of this, and this would make him a felon. But these burglaries didn't stop after this. In 1982, Stephen had just recently married a woman named Lori. While they were on their honeymoon, Stephen broke into someone's garage again when Lori was in the car. So he drove to this person's residence with Lori in the car, broke into this garage, and took a little mini bike and a riding mower. He then took these items to his house and painted not the riding mower, excuse me, it was a push mower, but he took the push mower and painted it so that no one would recognize it. He then took the mini bike and dumped it 2 miles from his house so that no one would see it and suspect that he had stolen this. Lori was sitting in the car when he did this. He put the push mower in the trunk of his car and the little mini bike in the back seat of the car and then took them to his house while he was on his honeymoon with Lori. While burglary doesn't necessarily mean that you are a murderer, it does show that Stephen has a history with law enforcement, and they probably weren't, like, especially when it comes to the Penny Bernstein case, they probably weren't just like grasping at straws trying to find Stephen Avery. Like, he was known to law enforcement for a pretty long time. But again, that does not mean that Stephen is a murderer. I'm just trying to show what kind of a relationship Stephen has with law enforcement at the time. But this isn't the end of Stephen's affiliation with law enforcement, I guess you could say. And it seems like Stephen just liked to steal things and that he wasn't violent with people, but that's also incorrect. Stephen did have a history of being violent with other people. People like friends, if they owed him money, he would often threaten them or beat them up. His sister Barb, there was often talk of him beating up his sister Barb and like leaving her with a bloody nose and stuff like that. Now, this could be a case of sibling rivalry, but it wasn't just Barb that he was violent with. In the beginning of 1982, Stephen was dating a woman named Wendy, and they had been dating for about 8 weeks, and that's when he proposed to Wendy. But Wendy denied this proposal. She didn't want to get married to Stephen, and this would eventually end the relationship. It did end the relationship, and not long after, Stephen started dating Lori. And then 6 weeks after dating Lori, he proposed to her and she did accept his proposal. They got married in July of 1982. But after Wendy said no to his proposal, he started stalking her. Like, it was really quite creepy what he did to her. Like, if she went to a friend's house, Stephen would follow her there and then wait outside the house for her. He would also threaten to bust out her windows. He would threaten to shoot her. Like, he was absolutely violent with her. Even after Stephen married Lori, this didn't stop him stalking Wendy. But speaking of Lori, he and Lori's relationship wasn't great either. In fact, Lori would tell investigators after Stephen was arrested for the murder of Teresa Halbach that she genuinely believed that had Stephen not been wrongfully arrested and then convicted, Stephen would have eventually killed her. Lori says that their relationship was plagued with DV of all kinds, that he was very towards her. Stephen was very controlling of Lori. He wouldn't let her go do things that she needed to do without him. He would often beat her and choke her. Like, he was very, very violent with Lori. But it wasn't just Lori, it was also their children. So Lori actually had a child before, with like in another relationship before Stephen, and this boy's name was Jason. So Stephen kind of stepped into that father role, and there was one time that Lori was able to leave the house without Stephen, and Lori left the children in Stephen's care. When Lori came back, Jason was missing his front teeth, and allegedly Stephen punched Jason in the mouth after Jason showed him up. After Jason proved him wrong, Stephen got so angry that he punched him in the mouth and knocked out his front teeth. Again, this is alleged. He was never convicted of any of this, but it still shows exactly who Stephen was or what he was capable of, if it is true. But according to Stephen's brother Earl, Stephen was always kind of mean to Jason, and they kind of speculate that it was because he wasn't Stephen's biological son. But it wasn't just Jason that Stephen wasn't exactly nice to, it was also his other children. When his other children didn't like coming to visit him in prison because he would often spank them and poke them and pinch them and like punish them when they came to visit him while he was in prison. About 3 years into his prison sentence, Lori finally filed for divorce, and this was because I think she just couldn't handle it anymore. There are some pretty violent letters sent between the two, between Lori and Stephen. Lori saying things like she's going to end her life and then the life of her children, and then Stephen saying that he's going to kill Lori. Even from prison, all of us, you know, he's saying things like, one day your car's not going to start, and when I get out, I'm going to take the kids and run and run. And he would send letters to his children saying that he is going to kill Lori and then mutilate her private parts. Like, these were violent letters that were sent from Stephen to Lori. When Lori did finally divorce Stephen, this seemed to really upset him, and he would write the judges and also like Child Protective Services saying that Lori needed to be investigated. Lori was investigated, but they found that after Lori left Stephen, she was in a much better place, and she was actually a really good mother to her children. Like, she enjoyed her children and was perfectly capable of raising them. But this kind of flipped on Stephen, and Stephen was investigated. And what they found is that the kids didn't like to come visit him, and it seemed like the kids just didn't really like Stephen. Their investigation led them to terminating visitations with Stephen. So Stephen's visitation rights were completely terminated after this investigation. And Stephen was never really able to recoup the relationship with his children. One of his daughters, after he was released, did visit him for a period of time, but that seemed to end after a while as well. But like I said, Stephen was not convicted of anything DV-wise when it came to Lori or the children, but his rights to visit his children were terminated, but there were never any convictions of any of this. This is just what Lori had said later on after she had left Stephen. Now, while Stephen was never convicted of any DV situation when it came to Lori, there are certain crimes that Stephen was absolutely convicted of, and those involve animal cruelty. So if you've seen Making a Murderer, you've seen the conviction that Stephen did have when it came to this cat that he basically burned alive. In Making a Murderer, they do discuss this a little bit, but they allow Stephen to tell the story, and Stephen says that he was drinking with his buddies and he decided to throw the cat over the fire that they had going. That's not exactly the full story. What actually happened is Stephen was hanging out with a group of his friends, and they did have a fire going, and they were drinking, but Stephen had the idea to kill this cat. In the police report, it is said that Stephen chased this cat down and then doused it in oil and gasoline, and then had one of his friends throw the cat in the fire. If that isn't bad enough, the cat didn't die from this. The cat actually crawled out of the fire, and Stephen then poured more oil and gasoline on the cat and threw it back into the fire. Stephen says that he did this because he didn't want the cat to suffer, which the cat suffered. And you have to be very cruel to do that. Stephen was convicted of animal cruelty when it came to this, but this isn't the only time Stephen was accused of animal cruelty. This story, Stephen was never convicted of it, and it's just a story told by his brother, but his brother did say that Stephen at one point had a German Shepherd that got out and ran away. When Stephen found the dog, he put a chain on the dog's collar and then held that chain out of his car window and then drove home and dragged the dog back home. This was the dog's punishment for running away. Again, this is anecdotal. There is no evidence of this. He was never convicted of any animal cruelty charges when it came to this, but I did want to mention it because so often when we start researching serial killers or people like this, we look into their past and we realize that one of the first signs we see of something being wrong is cruelty towards animals. While there is no solid proof that Stephen did this to the German Shepherd, there is proof that Stephen did this to the cat. He fully admitted to doing this. And I think it's very important to remember that and understand that there was more to him just throwing a cat over a fire, that this was an intentional thing that he did. We have to understand that to understand Stephen Avery a little bit better. I think that is huge in understanding this case a little bit more. But Stephen himself would often say that he was a very impulsive person and he would probably do better if he just took a little bit of time to think before he acted. This was proven when it comes to the Sandra Morris case. Now, again, the Sandra Morris case was talked about in Making a Murderer, but again, I feel like it was kind of brushed under the rug and it wasn't really talked about to the full details of what actually happened that day. But Sandra Morris kind of gets a bad rap when it comes to Making a Murderer. So I want to kind of discuss what exactly happened between Stephen Avery and Sandra Morris. In Making a Murderer, it's kind of made to seem like it wasn't that bad and Sandra Morris made a big deal, like she made a mountain out of a molehill. But Sandra Morris was actually accusing Stephen of exposing himself while she drove past his house. Sandra Morris was kind of a cousin of Stephen Avery and she was also a neighbor, so she would drive past his house frequently in 1985 when all of this happened. In Making a Murderer, they make it sound like Sandra Morris had gone to the police and told them about Stephen and Lori having adult relations in their front yard for all of the neighbors to see. Sandra Morris never actually made that claim and she never called the police about it. The only thing that Sandra Morris ever did was Stephen Avery was at a bar with one of Sandra's cousins and Sandra went up to her cousin and kind of told her about Stephen exposing himself to her as she drove by her house. And Sandra made it known that she didn't really like Stephen. I don't think she was secretive about that at all. She did not like Stephen, but all she did was tell her cousin, who was at the bar with Stephen Avery, that Stephen was exposing himself to her as she drove by. But in Making a Murderer, there is a clip where they make it seem like Sandra called the police and told the police that Stephen and Lori were having adult relations in their front yard for all of the neighbors to see. That was actually not Sandra Morris. Sandra Morris had nothing to do with that call coming into the police department. It was actually another one of Stephen Avery's neighbors who called in anonymously to complain of Stephen having relations with his wife on their front yard. But this would cause Stephen to kind of snap. And one morning when Sandra was driving past his house, Stephen got into his car and followed Sandra, chased her down, and hit the back of her car, running her off the road. Again, in Making a Murderer, they say that he pointed an unloaded gun at her and threatened her. But that's not exactly what happened. Stephen did run Sandra off the road, and he did point a gun at her. But he didn't just threaten her. Stephen told her to turn off her car and get into his. So that's an abduction. Stephen was attempting to abduct Sandra. And another important detail that they leave out is that Sandra actually had her young daughter in the car with her. Sandra actually had to beg Stephen to just let her take her daughter to her mother's house so that she would be safe. This was the middle of the winter. If she had shut off her car and left that baby there by themselves, they could have potentially been very, very hurt. And who knows what Stephen wanted to do with Sandra after he had abducted her. That's what he was trying to do. So Sandra begged for Stephen to just allow her to take her daughter to her mom's house right down the road, and then she would go with Stephen. Stephen eventually agreed to this. Sandra got back in her car and drove to her mother's house, but Stephen didn't follow her. Instead, Stephen went home. So Sandra called the police, as she should have. And when police came, Stephen pretended like he was asleep when they first came, but one of the officers went to his car and realized that the manifold was warm, as if the car had just been driven. And then they found the firearm that Stephen was using in one of the kids' bedrooms under the bed, and the gun was cold, as if it had been outside. So Stephen eventually did admit that he did this and was charged with attempted abduction. Stephen would be convicted of this and charged to 6 years in prison. The charges for the Penny Bernstein case came right at the heels of the Sandra Morris case. So when people say that Stephen Avery did 18 years in prison for a crime he did not commit, that's not completely accurate. Stephen actually spent 6 years in prison for the Sandra Morris case. So 6 years of those 18 years were for the Sandra Morris case, and then he spent 12 years in prison wrongfully. Do not get me wrong, 12 years is way too long to spend in prison for any amount of time spent in prison for something you did not do is too long. But 6 of those years were justified that he was supposed to be in prison. He was sitting out the sentence he had for the abduction, the attempted kidnapping for Sandra Morris. But the allegations towards Stephen Avery don't stop here. After Stephen was released in 2003, he started spending a lot of time with his nieces and nephews. He had lost a lot of time, obviously, so I think he just kind of wanted to make up for lost time. But Stephen started spending a lot of time with his niece, Marie Avery. Now, Marie was not his niece by blood. Earl Avery, which is Stephen's younger brother, had married a woman named Candy, and Candy had a child, Marie, from another relationship. But Earl would adopt Marie a year into their marriage. Then Earl and Candy had a couple more children together, and I think they had 2 more girls together. It was shortly after Stephen got out of prison in 2003 that Stephen and Marie started spending a good amount of time together. They would go to the cabin in Crivets together. They would ride around town together. Like, they would just spend a lot of time together. And at first it seemed like an innocent thing, like Stephen was just being a good uncle and spending time with his nieces and nephews. But then Kayla Avery, who was another daughter of Candy and Earl, came forward to her mother and to Candy and said that Stephen had touched her inappropriately, had touched her in places that she didn't feel comfortable with. And Candy went to Stephen and said that is your niece. If this happens, if I hear of this happening again, I will report you to law enforcement. But it wasn't long after this that Kayla Avery, which Candy and Earl's daughter, found pictures in Marie's room that were alarming, to say the least. These pictures were taken at the cabin in Crivets. We're just riding around, and they were of Stephen and Marie. There were pictures of Stephen pouring alcohol down Marie's throat. There were pictures of Marie with her shirt pushed up and her bra showing, and then with Stephen written on her body. There were also pictures of her hands pinned behind her head and stuff like that, and very alarming pictures that just were not appropriate in the situation that they are. I think anyone would feel super uncomfortable if their 17-year-old daughter, or if they found these pictures, if somebody found the pictures of their 17-year-old daughter with their 40-something-year-old uncle that were like this, anyone would be alarmed. But the more alarming allegations came after Stephen was arrested for the murder of Teresa Halbach. Investigators from Calumet County would come and speak to Marie Avery, and she would tell investigators that Stephen had forced himself on her. Marie, who would have been 17 at the time, said that she was spending time at her Aunt Barbara's house, and that Stephen had come in and he had kind of tricked her into going into one of the boys' room, and that's where he had essayed her. Marie would have been 17 years old at the time, very much a minor, very much not able to consent to this. I will say, though, that Kathleen Zellner, who is Stephen Avery's new attorney, says that she has spoken to Marie Avery, and she says that none of it is true, that she was coerced into saying all of this. But there is recorded phone calls of Stephen in the prison talking to his mother, and he talks about these photos and that he burned them. So we do know that there were photos of Stephen. And then there's also the recorded phone calls with Stephen's fiancée, Jody, where he talks about having a relationship with Marie. He talks about letters that he had from Marie saying that she was in love with him and wanted to be with him, and that he had kept those for evidence in case something like this came up. So, yeah. Do with that what you will, but Marie would not have been able to consent as she was a minor. Charges were never brought against Stephen Avery, as he was currently facing charges for the murder of Teresa Halbach. And so it seems like the Calumet County decided not to proceed further with the charges against Stephen Avery when it came to these essay charges. But they did say that if Stephen were to ever get out of prison, that they would then move forward with charging him. But this is going to bring me to my final point in today's video, and that is Jody Stokowski. I probably said her last name wrong, but I, for the love of me, cannot say it. But Jody and Stephen started dating about a year after he got out of prison. And in Making a Murderer, they do kind of show his relationship with Jody a little bit, and it seems like everything was going really well. But soon after Making a Murderer came out, Jody actually sat down with HLN and did an interview saying that she genuinely believed that Stephen was Avery of Teresa Halbach's murder. During this interview, Jody says that she was also a victim of Stephen Avery, that he was very physical with her, and that she was not surprised at all that Stephen Avery had actually committed this murder. Jody goes into detail about some of the instances where Stephen was violent with her. She talks about how when she would drink, Stephen would often beat her, and this is backed up by Earl Avery, who also saw this. And there are several other Avery family members who talk about witnessing Stephen beat up on Jody. This was kind of an open secret. But there was one night in particular where Stephen and Jody were fighting, and she attempted to call the police. He ripped the telephone out of the wall and began choking Jody. He did this until she lost consciousness, and when she woke up, he was dragging her to her car. Stephen and Jody would be pulled over eventually, and Stephen was taken into custody. In the police report, it is stated that they could smell alcohol on Jody's breath, and they didn't see any visible marks on her neck. But a bruise like that would take a little bit to show up. It wouldn't just show up suddenly like that, but I do feel like there would have been a red mark or something on her neck, but they didn't see anything like that. But I would like to say that just because Jody had a alcohol problem doesn't mean that she wasn't telling the truth here. Also, not saying that she's not like that she's, you know, I want to keep my personal opinion out of this completely, because I don't know what went on personally in that relationship. I'm just saying what Jody said and what family members back it up with. They also say that they saw Stephen hit Jody several times. There was another incident that happened before Stephen was wrongfully convicted in 1985, and that was one of Stephen and Lori's babysitters. She said that she had been hired by Stephen and Lori to babysit their children, and when Stephen and Lori came home, Lori had gone upstairs to go to bed, and Stephen stayed downstairs, and that's where he also forced himself on her. So there are several people accusing Stephen of forcing himself on them. This doesn't seem like a one-off thing. This just seems like something that Stephen has been accused of multiple times. But again, he's never been charged of anything, so this is all alleged. While all of this does not mean that Stephen is guilty of the Teresa Halbach murder, I just feel like it's important to really understand the case. You have to understand Stephen and who he was. I'm hoping on Saturday I'll have another video up and we'll go more into the evidence and kind of the rebuttal that Convicting a Murderer had with some of the evidence that was found, and that one's going to be a very long and very interesting one. So if you want to check that out, I'm hoping it'll be here on Saturday. But yeah, that's kind of all I have for you today. I hope this finds you well, and I hope this finds you safe and loved and all of those good things. But yeah, that's all I have for you today. I will see you Saturday, as long as everything goes as planned. I am not a professional YouTuber, but yeah, I will see you soon. Love you all.